July 14th, 1994.
Rochester, Pennsylvania. After leaving her home, 14-year-old Sarah Boehm goes missing, and a letter is soon found inside her bedroom in which Sarah mentions being in a relationship with an abusive older man and expresses a desire to run away. Over 3 months later, a murdered Jane Doe is found in the Berlin Lake Wildlife Area in Ohio, and in 2003, she's positively identified as Sarah. It turns out that the body of another murdered girl, 17-year-old Kathryn Menendez, was found in the same wildlife area only a month after Sarah went missing. But even though investigators explore the possibility that both girls were killed by the same person, the crimes remain unsolved. And after that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be exploring a pair of cold cases involving teenage girls which might possibly be connected. The 1994 murders of Sarah Boehm and Kathryn Menendez. That voice you just heard narrating our intro was Maria Milchman, the latest winner of our most recent Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, so thank you very much, Maria. This is a recurring monthly contest which we've been carrying on for 7 years now, so if you'd like to enter and haven't already done so, I will be providing instructions near the end of this episode. Anyway, even though Sarah Boehm hailed from Pennsylvania and Kathryn Menendez lived in Ohio, they were apparently murdered within 1 month of each other, and their bodies were found about a half-mile apart in a remote section of the Berlin Lake Wildlife Area in Portage County, Ohio. Sarah went missing after leaving her residence in Rochester, Pennsylvania, located about 50 miles away, and since she left behind a letter which seemed to be expressing a desire to run away, the local authorities were initially inclined to believe she took off voluntarily. But Sarah's remains would be discovered in the Berlin Lake Wildlife Area 3.5 months after she disappeared, and she remained an unidentified Jane Doe for nearly 9 years, but the evidence strongly indicated that she was the victim of a homicide. Kathryn Menendez was also the victim of a violent homicide, and since she and Sarah were each discovered in an area that was not particularly easy to find, this has led to speculation that the same perpetrator may have been responsible for murdering both girls. On the other hand, there was no real connection between the two victims, and in Sarah's case at least, there is evidence to suggest that she was killed by someone in her personal life, as there are doubts about the veracity of the letter she supposedly left behind, as it may have been used to intentionally mislead the investigation. Whatever happened, the only thing we know for certain is that we've just passed the 30-year anniversary of these two murders, and they're both still unsolved, so on this episode, we're going to try and figure out if they are connected, or if it's nothing more than a coincidence that Sarah and Kathryn's bodies just happen to be found in the same area. In addition, when Maria Milchman originally entered our voiceover contest, she requested that I cover the 1995 murder of 16-year-old Anna Marie Callahan, another teenage girl from Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, there is not enough available information about that case for a full episode, but after I'm done discussing Sarah and Kathryn's murders, I'll take a few moments to talk about what happened to Anna. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has nearly 80 exclusive bonus episodes and archives which are not available on our regular feed. I also wanted to announce that this coming Saturday, August the 24th, we'll be holding one of our annual Unsolved Mysteries live watch marathons in which I screen classic segments from the show, and you can watch them and chat with myself and your fellow listeners. It's taking place at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and if you'd like to join us, you can find the link to our screening room in our show notes, as well as pinned to the top of our social media pages. Hope to see you there. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the murders of Sarah Boehm and Kathryn Menendez. Our story begins in 1994 in Rochester, Pennsylvania, a borough which is located in Beaver County and part of the Pittsburgh metropolitan area and had a population of just over 4,000 at that time. Our central figure is 14-year-old Sarah Ray Boehm, who currently lives with her mother Phyllis and 17-year-old brother Mason. At this point, Sarah's parents are separated as her father, Jack Boehm, has been struggling with alcoholism and a gambling addiction and moved out of the family's residence. Sarah is reportedly taking her parents' separation quite hard and is known for being a shy, quiet, and introverted girl in general. On the evening of July the 14th, Sarah was being watched over at home by her brother Mason at the residence on Mellon Avenue while her mother was out working an overnight shift, but Sarah spoke to Phyllis over the phone and said she wanted to go visit her friend Jennifer, who lived 2 blocks away, and stay there for a sleepover. Sarah was granted permission to do so, and Mason would later say that he saw his sister leave the residence at around 10:45 p.m. in order to walk to Jennifer's place. But unfortunately, this would turn out to be the last time Sarah was confirmed to be alive. The following morning, after Phyllis returned home from work, she received a phone call that Sarah had missed a counseling appointment she had scheduled. When Phyllis phoned Jennifer to find out where Sarah was, she was shocked to learn that no sleepover had taken place the previous night. While Sarah had called Jennifer to inquire about a sleepover, Jennifer told her that they could not have one since her family had company coming over. Since Sarah had still not returned home and no one knew where she really went after she left her residence, Phyllis became concerned enough to contact the Rochester Township Police Department in order to report Sarah missing. Well, 2 days after Sarah vanished, a 2-page letter which was supposedly written by her was discovered underneath her pillow on her bed. For years, neither Sarah's family nor law enforcement would publicly release the contents of this letter, and I'll be going into more detail about this later on, but the letter seemed to give investigators the impression that Sarah had run away voluntarily. As the years went on, law enforcement would receive a number of reported sightings of Sarah throughout Beaver County, which seemed to suggest that she was still alive. As a result, Sarah's case was not actually submitted to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children until 1998, and they subsequently entered her information into their database. Shortly thereafter, the Beaver County District Attorney's Office joined the investigation. At the time Sarah went missing, her father Jack was living with a new girlfriend named Marianne Good, and he would eventually get remarried to her after his divorce with Phyllis went through. However, in August of 2000, there would be a shocking development when Jack was arrested for sexually abusing a 12-year-old female relative of his over the course of the previous 20 months. The arrest came about after the girl told her parents about what Jack was doing, and 2 months later, he would plead guilty to the charges of indecent assault and corrupting the morals of a minor, for which he received a $500 fine and a sentence of 3 to 12 months, though he wound up serving most of it under house arrest rather than in jail. The girl had been documenting the abuse she received from Jack, and at one point, she wrote a note which read, quote, "I don't want to happen to me what happened to his daughter." When Jack was questioned about this note, he was very evasive and claimed to have no idea what the girl was referring to. He denied any involvement in Sarah's disappearance and agreed to take a polygraph, but the results were inconclusive. An extensive search was performed of Jack's house, which involved digging up his basement and bringing in cadaver dogs, but no evidence of foul play could be found. Even though investigators had their suspicions about Jack, he did seem to have a solid alibi on the night Sarah went missing, as he had been out camping at the Jamboree in the Hills Music Festival in Belmont County, Ohio, which was about 80 miles outside of Rochester, and a number of other people were able to confirm his whereabouts. In 2001, a Beaver County District Attorney's Office detective named Kim Clemens was browsing the Doe Network website and came across the profile page for an unidentified Jane Doe who had been found in Portage County, Ohio several years earlier. On November the 4th, 1994, a pair of hunters stumbled across the victim's nude body in a remote section of the Berlin Lake Wildlife Area near Fewtown Road. While her body was heavily decomposed and mostly skeletonized, she appeared to have strawberry blonde hair, much like Sarah. While an autopsy was unable to determine her exact cause of death, it was believed that she was the victim of a homicide. And since she could not be identified, she became known as the Portage County Jane Doe, and her remains were kept at the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office. Even though the Jane Doe had been found 50 miles away from Rochester, Detective Clements looked at the composite sketch for a facial reconstruction of the victim on her Doe Network profile page and thought she bore a striking resemblance to Sarah Boehm. Years earlier, another detective from Portage County had also noticed the similarities and contacted the Rochester Township Police Department, but since there had been so many reported sightings of Sarah, the Rochester Township PD were still operating under the assumption that she was still alive somewhere and dismissed the possibility that she was the Jane Doe. As an example, in May of 2000, two of Sarah's cousins were convinced that they'd seen her at a restaurant in Rochester Township called the Deer Lane Grill. Investigators uncovered some surveillance footage from the establishment, which featured a young woman who resembled Sarah, and when some other family members viewed the footage, they became convinced it was her. In spite of this, Detective Clements thought the Jane Doe angle deserved a second look, and since it was possible that Sarah had been abducted and taken across state lines, the FBI were brought in to assist with the investigation. Surprisingly, when they asked Phyllis for a sample of Sarah's DNA in order to make a comparison with the Jane Doe, she initially refused to provide it, and her DNA would not be collected until after investigators obtained a court order. Unfortunately, there would be a number of other delays, as the initial DNA sample taken from the decedent's remains turned out to be too small for a sufficient analysis, and the FBI lab soon found themselves experiencing an overwhelming backlog when the September 11th attacks took place, and they were forced to perform testing on the remains of numerous victims killed during the tragedy. But the DNA comparison was eventually performed, and on June 3, 2003, the Beaver County District Attorney's Office finally announced that a match had been made, and Sarah was positively identified as being the Portage County Jane Doe. Her remains were eventually transferred back to Rochester, and she was given a proper burial at Sylviana Memorial Hills Park. Sarah's case officially went from being a missing persons investigation to a homicide investigation, and it turned out that another teenage girl had been found murdered in the Berlin Lake Wildlife Area during the same time period when Sarah was killed. The victim in question was 17-year-old Kathryn Menendez, who lived in the town of Alliance, Ohio, located in Stark County, just over 6 miles south of the wildlife area. On the evening of August the 20th, 1994, Kathryn, who went by the name Kathy, turned down the opportunity to go see a movie with her family so that she could spend the night with a friend. The following morning, Kathy was reportedly seen visiting neighbors after leaving her friend's residence, but she never returned home, and her mother, Janet Menendez, soon reported Kathy missing to the Alliance Police Department. Since Kathy had a prior history of running away, the police reportedly did not take her disappearance all that seriously at first, but 4 days later, on August the 25th, an oil and gas company worker was heading down a remote oil well access road located next to Fewtown Road in the Berlin Lake Wildlife Area when he stumbled across Kathy's nude body on a dirt track. She had been beaten, stabbed with a screwdriver, and cut with a knife before she was strangled to death. Kathy's clothing was never recovered, and investigators believe that she was murdered at another location before her body was dumped in the woods, approximately 24 to 48 hours before she was found. Since Kathy was found only about a half-mile away from the spot where Sarah's remains would be discovered, investigators started looking into the possible connections between the two crimes. Even though Kathy was murdered 1 month after Sarah originally went missing, it was suspected that Sarah had already been killed and had her body dumped in the wildlife area by that point, but it just wasn't noticed until November of that year. For her part, Janet Menendez believed it was nothing more than a coincidence that Kathy and Sarah's bodies were both found in the area, as she suspected her daughter was killed by someone she knew. Kathy was known for running with a rowdy crowd, and Janet told the press that she provided investigators with the names of 3 men from the area whom she felt could have been responsible for Kathy's death. The names of these 3 men have never been released publicly, but they were all slightly older than Kathy, and when police asked them to take polygraph tests, they all refused. According to Janet, one of these individuals was 18 years old at the time of Kathy's death and had a crush on her, but he also had a violent history. There was one incident where he reportedly showed up at the front door of Kathy's residence, and Kathy asked her mother to tell him she wasn't there because she didn't want to socialize with him. In spite of this, the investigations into Kathy and Sarah's murders hit a standstill, but in November of 2011, the FBI finally decided to publicly release the full contents of the letter found in Sarah's bedroom after she went missing. As you recall, this letter was discovered underneath a pillow, but the FBI now revealed that it was inside an envelope which had the words, quote, "To whoever cares," written on it. The letter was 2 pages long, and I'm now going to read the contents of each page. The first page read, quote, "I've always said, the day I walk out the door is the day I'll never return. I've thought everything over and it is best I leave. I'm just a burden. I create problems. I've always learned you don't have time for me and that you don't care. I've been forced to grow up in ways you don't realize. When my brother and mother went crazy, everybody forgot about me. This left me vulnerable. I met a guy who gave me love and whatever else I was not getting at home. He was a very, very abusive man. Didn't anyone wonder why I always had injuries and said I fell? Anyway, I was never good enough, so I quit eating. That's why I was passing out. But again, everybody couldn't see that. I've learned to live on my own. I'm very independent. I did what I had to do to live. Now I'll really live on my own. Don't worry, I'll survive. Maybe I'll even be a cardiologist or musician. Who knows?" End quote. And here's what the second page read. Quote, "The law is that parents have custody of their kids until they turn 18. I may only be 14 years old on the outside, but I'm 25 on the inside. I know how to take care of myself. Hell, I've been doing it for years now. I'm pretty good at it too. I don't want to hurt anyone. If I do, I'm sorry. Really, I am. I have a better chance of surviving on my own out in the world than I do here in Rochester, Pennsylvania. Remember, it is nobody's fault. I was not forced to leave. If I stayed, however, I'd be miserable. If I left, I'd be happy. I don't want anyone to worry. I promise I'll be fine. If I realize I can't do it on my own, I'll come home if they'll have me. But I'm pretty confident I'll be okay. I don't mind you don't love me, but please don't hate me. Please don't try to find me, because you won't find me. By the time you read this note, I'll be gone. Maybe to DC or New York City. I haven't decided yet. Maybe I'll be a musician or a cardiologist. They're both big cities, so you won't be able to find me. This is all for the best. Wish me luck and say a prayer for me, okay? I'm sorry, Sarah Ray Boehm." End quote. In addition, a poem was written on the envelope in French, and here's the English translation. Quote, I'm sorry. It's necessary to leave. It's for the best. Don't try to trace me. I'm fine. I would like to be very, very fine. I'm not staying here. I'm unhappy here. I love everyone. Believe me, please. It's not your fault. I would like to survive. P.S. Read the letter. Bye for always and for eternity. Until the next time, bye for now. End quote. Well, investigators found a number of unusual things about the letter. It was sent to the Pennsylvania State Police Crime Lab, and after comparing it to other known samples of Sarah's writing, they concluded that the letter was in her handwriting. But the issue is that each page was written in a different type of ink, and a bottom section of the second page appeared to have been torn off. In addition, the writing on the envelope appeared to be in yet another different type of ink than the ink used on the letter. The second page did not have any imprints of the writing from the first page, which seemed to indicate that they were not written on the same pad of paper. The transition from the first page to the second page also seemed rather abrupt, almost as if there was a passage of text missing, So investigators began to suspect that each page may have been completely separate pieces of writing penned by Sarah at different times, which were then cobbled together into this so-called letter. One friend told investigators that Sarah kept a journal before she went missing, and while this led to speculation that the letter may have been two separate pages, this alleged journal was never found. Oddly, when Sarah's family turned up the letter underneath her pillow, her bed was described as being neatly made at the time, even though it was very atypical of her to make her bed. Jack Boehm initially only provided a photocopy of the letter to investigators, and Phyllis wound up holding on to the original and kept it inside a Bible until she gave it to the FBI years later. 5 sets of unidentified fingerprints, which did not match Sarah or her family, were found on the original copy of the letter, as well as a lipstick stain belonging to Jack's former spouse, Marianne Good, though it apparently got on there after she fainted while she had the letter in her hand. It did not appear that Sarah's letter was addressed to anyone in particular, but investigators were hoping to identify this quote-unquote abusive man she had referred to. As far as most of her friends and family knew, Sarah did not have a boyfriend at the time she went missing and had no idea who this man could be. Jack did tell the authorities that he believed his daughter had a boyfriend known only as Tony Z, but while they looked into everyone from the area who had a variation of that name, none of them had any known connection to Sarah, so it could not be conclusively proven if this Tony Z actually existed. Investigators stated that they looked at several people whom they felt could have been the secret boyfriend, but were unable to establish if any of them were. However, it did not seem implausible that Sarah could have been involved with someone who was abusive towards her. In addition to having a shy, quiet, and introverted personality, Sarah was known for keeping her head down and never looking anyone in the eye whenever she spoke with them, and investigators consulted with some psychologists who felt this behavior could have been a sign that she was being abused or even molested. Marianne Good would also tell the press that when she last saw Sarah before her disappearance, her face appeared to be purple, as if she had recently been punched, but even though Marianne asked her what was wrong, Sarah refused to answer. What also turned out that in September of 1993, 10 months before she went missing, Sarah had supposedly been the victim of an attempted abduction, which left her with some bruises. She claimed that while walking through an alley after leaving church, she was accosted by an unidentified man who punched her a few times, but she managed to fight him off and escaped to her grandmother's house, where she called the police. The incident would be reported on by the Pittsburgh-based TV station WTAE-TV, and Sarah even wound up being interviewed on camera by Channel 4 Action News, where she stated, quote, "I was just thinking, oh God, just don't let him kill me," end quote. Sarah described the assailant as being 5'7" with thin brown hair and big eyebrows and wearing a dark blue t-shirt and dark sweatpants. While a composite sketch was created for this man and circulated by the media, he was never identified, and police eventually began to doubt the veracity of Sarah's story. Following her disappearance, they started to wonder if the injuries that Sarah sustained during the so-called attack may have actually been caused by someone who was abusing her, so she fabricated this attempted stranger abduction as a cover story to explain her bruises. It's also been reported that investigators received information about Sarah attending a party at a local cemetery 2 nights before she went missing, which they believed might have significance to the case, but they were unable to find anyone who could confirm having attended this party or verify that it actually happened. Even though he was never conclusively linked to his daughter's murder, Jack Boehm continued to live under a cloud of suspicion until he passed away in February of 2016 at the age of 66. According to his brother, Kevin Boehm, he asked Jack on his deathbed if he had anything to tell him about Sarah, but Jack simply replied, quote, "No, I just want to find my daughter." In September of 2021, Sarah's story received some additional attention when it was featured on an episode of the popular investigation discovery true crime TV series On the Case with Paula Zahn, which was titled What Happened to Sarah. A few months later, in November of that year, the Beaver County District Attorney's Office announced that they had a strong person of interest who was serving time in prison, and Detective Andy Gall stated, quote, "We have a particular person scheduled to take a polygraph very soon who spent time here in Beaver County and in Portage County during that particular time," end quote. However, no further information has been released about this individual and whether or not they took the polygraph. But there has been a recent development in Kathryn Menendez's case. In June of 2024, just 2 months before this episode's release, Kathy's body was exhumed in hopes of obtaining DNA evidence, as it was not collected following her murder 30 years earlier due to the forensic limitations which existed at that time. Sadly, Kathy's father Leonard died in 2003, while her mother Janet just passed away in February of this year at the age of 72, but before she left this world, Janet did grant her consent for her daughter's exhumation. At the time of this recording, no information has been released about what type of forensic evidence, if any, has been collected from Kathy's remains. All we know for certain is that after 30 years, the murders of Sarah Boehm and Kathryn Menendez both continue to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So even though I'm technically covering 2 unsolved cold cases on this episode, which may or may not be connected, there definitely seems to be a lot more information available about Sarah Boehm's case than Kathryn Menendez's case. While Sarah's story is flush with weird details, all we really know about Kathy's murder is that she had a history of running away and hanging out with a rough crowd. Janet Menendez said there were at least 3 people from Kathy's personal life who seemed like they could be potential suspects in her murder, but since they've never been publicly named and we don't have any information about them, I can't really speculate about the likelihood of their culpability. However, while we don't know Sarah's exact cause of death, Kathy's murder seems to be a case of major overkill, as she was beaten and tortured with a number of different instruments before she was strangled to death, though investigators have never publicly confirmed if she was sexually assaulted. That could point to it being a personal crime committed by someone with a lot of rage and hatred towards Kathy, but it could also mean she fell victim to a serial killer who had a lot of experience at this sort of thing. Since Sarah and Kathy's bodies were found in a remote area only a half-mile apart, it's always been up for debate if they were both murdered by the same perpetrator or if the placement of their bodies was nothing more than a coincidence. The key difference is that while Sarah hailed from Pennsylvania, Kathy lived in the town of Alliance, only a few miles south of the Berlin Lake Wildlife Area. If Kathy's murder was a personal crime committed by someone she knew, I think that decreases the likelihood of the cases being connected, since there's no reason for the perpetrator to travel 50 miles to a different state to kill Sarah. But like I just mentioned, the good news is that Kathy's body was exhumed earlier this year in hopes of obtaining DNA evidence belonging to her killer, and if this process is successful, then hopefully this will lead to a resolution. If by chance the crimes are linked and both victims were killed by the same person, then a DNA match could potentially close the books on 2 cold cases. In regards to the serial killer angle, one convicted offender who has been pushed forward as a potential suspect is Larry Dwayne Hall. Now, I've already discussed Hall on previous episodes of this podcast, including the 1991 disappearance of Angela Hammond, the 1992 murder of Lori Deppes, and the 1992 disappearances of Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall, aka the Springfield Three. Hall once claimed to have been responsible for the unsolved disappearances and murders of no less than 45 girls and women, which took place throughout the Midwest during the 1980s and early 1990s, but he recanted his confession, and it's worth noting that the only crime he has officially been convicted of is the 1993 kidnapping and death of 15-year-old Jessica Roach, which is why I always hesitate to refer to Hall as a serial killer. Hall is currently serving a life sentence at a federal prison in North Carolina, but since he was not actually arrested until December of 1994, he still would have had the opportunity to murder Sarah Boehm and Kathryn Menendez. The main reason Hall seemed to be pushed forward as this boogeyman who is responsible for all these unsolved crimes is because he was a Civil War buff who liked to travel around the country and participate in reenactments, which would have given him the opportunity to kill random victims at all these places he visited and then leave the area before anyone suspected him. However, as far as I can tell, At no point has law enforcement ever publicly stated that they consider Hall to be a suspect in the murders of Sarah and Kathy, so his involvement in these crimes is based on nothing more than pure speculation. So let's get back to discussing the facts we do know. Since Sarah and Kathy's bodies were both discovered in a remote section of the Berlin Lake Wildlife Area, which was not particularly easy to find, investigators have theorized that one or both of these victims were killed by a local who had some familiarity with the area. This theory does make logical sense for Kathy's case since she lived nearby, and the evidence seemed to indicate that she was tortured and murdered at another location before her body was dumped in the woods. However, I'm not so sure why a local would travel 50 miles from Ohio to Pennsylvania in order to abduct and murder Sarah, and then transport her all the way back to Ohio to dispose of her body. Looking at the timeline, Sarah went missing in July of 1994, Kathy went missing and was found murdered in late August, and Sarah's remains were discovered in November. In spite of this, the authorities have always been inclined to believe that Sarah was murdered and dumped in the wildlife area before Kathy was killed, and Sarah's body just remained unnoticed there for months. If this whole thing is nothing more than a coincidence, and both girls were murdered by different individuals, then Sarah's killer may have gotten incredibly lucky that Kathy's body wound up being dumped in the same area, since that wound up complicating the investigation. And believe it or not, what further complicates things is that 2 other murders took place in the Berlin Lake Wildlife Area several months beforehand. These particular victims were 32-year-old Lisa Waters and her 31-year-old boyfriend Andy Hussey, who happened to be the son of a Portage County sheriff's lieutenant. On November 6, 1993, Lisa and Andy were both shot in the back while on the beach next to the Berlin Reservoir, only about 300 feet from the spot where Sarah was found, and it's believed that the perpetrator fired the fatal shots from a rifle while standing atop a 40-foot cliff overlooking the area. To this day, the crime remains unsolved, and while a couple of individuals have been investigated as potential suspects, the motive is still unknown. Now, even though the shooting took place not too far from where Sarah and Kathy's bodies were found, investigators have made it clear that they don't believe the cases are connected at all, as the MO is obviously a lot different. Regardless, local residents, who used to feel that the Berlin Lake Wildlife Area was a fairly peaceful and tranquil place, were pretty unsettled by the fact that 4 people were found dead there in the span of only 1 year. And as if this situation wasn't weird enough, in October of 1997, a 51-year-old East Akron resident named Danny Jenkins fatally shot and robbed a pair of brothers named Dwayne and William Lockard while they were out bow hunting for deer together in Harrison County. What's crazy is that 3 years earlier, shortly after Sarah's body was found in the Berlin Lake Wildlife Area, Jenkins was quoted in a local newspaper article as saying that he was one of the hunters who discovered her. However, following Jenkins' arrest, the authorities confirmed that this was not true and that Jenkins had lied. I see nothing to indicate that Jenkins was considered to be a suspect in Sarah's murder or any of the other unsolved crimes from the Berlin Lake Wildlife Area, but this whole story is just surrounded by bizarre events. So now let's start discussing the circumstances of how Sarah Boehm went missing from Rochester. Since Sarah left her house late at night, it's certainly possible she crossed paths with a completely random predator who killed her, but the problem is that she lied to her family about where she was going. She originally told her mother and brother that she was heading to her friend Jennifer's house for a sleepover, but Jennifer told them this was not the case. What's odd about the whole situation is that Sarah did ask Jennifer about the possibility of having a sleepover that night, but Jennifer said no since her family had company over. This seems to indicate that Sarah had legitimately been planning to see Jennifer, but then made a last-minute decision to go elsewhere. To this day, no one has ever come forward to say they made plans to see Sarah that night, but the fact that she was willing to lie to her family suggests that she was planning to do something they wouldn't have approved of. Also, the fact that Sarah suddenly changed her plans would seem to go against the idea that she was hoping to run away, and it sounds like the only personal possession she had on her when she left was her purse. But if Sarah didn't intend to run off, then why was that cryptic letter underneath her pillow? Investigators have made mention of rumors that Sarah attended a party at a local cemetery 2 nights before she went missing, but they were never able to find any independent corroboration that this party actually took place. But if it did, I suppose it's possible that Sarah could have returned to the cemetery and that's when something bad happened to her. The whole situation is so strange that investigators initially looked into the possibility that her brother Mason wasn't telling the truth about what happened that night and may have personally caused Sarah's disappearance. Mason was questioned by police, and while he said that he ordinarily would have gone out to the front porch to keep an eye on his sister while she walked away, he said that he got too involved with watching a movie that night, so he did not actually see where Sarah was heading after she left the house. One detail about Mason's account that investigators found odd is that he said he gave Sarah a weapon she could carry for protection, but while he initially said that the weapon was a combat knife, he changed his story and later said it was brass knuckles. In spite of this inconsistency, Mason was very cooperative and passed 2 polygraphs, and a forensic search of his residence turned up no evidence that foul play occurred there. You also have to keep in mind that at the time Mason was questioned, investigators did not yet know that Sarah was a Jane Doe who had been found murdered in Ohio. I have no idea if Mason drove or had access to a vehicle at that time, but it's hard to imagine a 17-year-old being able to transport his sister's body to another state 50 miles away and then returning home without attracting any attention. I do not believe that Mason is considered to be a suspect, and over the past several years, I've also seen him do a couple of interviews about Sarah's case in which he seems to come across as genuinely sincere. But as far as I can tell, one individual who has never spoken to the media is Sarah's mother, Phyllis. I see nothing to indicate that law enforcement has ever considered her to be a suspect, but she did initially refuse to provide a sample of her DNA for a comparison to the Portage County Jane Doe, and she would only comply after receiving a court order. That might seem incredibly suspicious, but different people grieve tragedy in different ways, and after being told for years that her daughter might still be alive somewhere, perhaps Phyllis was just trying to avoid facing up to the truth that Sarah had been murdered. I have no idea if anyone from Sarah's family withheld information about her disappearance and didn't reveal everything they knew, but it goes without saying that the 2-page letter that Sarah supposedly wrote is unquestionably the most bizarre aspect of this case. There's also been some conflicting information about the circumstances of how the letter was found. When the full contents of the letter were released to the public in 2011, some of the reporting stated that after Sarah went missing, her immediate family performed a search of her house and told police they found no clues. But then a few days later, one of Sarah's uncles, Luke Boehm, said that he discovered the letter underneath the pillow on Sarah's bed. However, when this case was featured on the aforementioned episode of On the Case with Paula Zahn, they reported that it was Sarah's father, Jack Boehm, who found the letter. Obviously, since some shocking revelations would come out about Jack in subsequent years, I'm sure this has only fueled speculation about the letter's authenticity or lack thereof. The one thing which does seem clear-cut is that the letter was penned by Sarah, as analysis showed that it did match her handwriting, but whether she intended to write this as one long letter or if the whole thing was patched together from 2 separate pieces of writing is up for debate. It's been theorized that this so-called letter may have been 2 separate pages containing 2 different entries written at different times inside a journal Sarah supposedly kept, though no journal was ever found, and it's never been conclusively established if it existed. But this would explain why each page was written in a different type of ink. I don't find this idea to be implausible, as it seems like Sarah needlessly repeats certain things on both pages, such as when she writes that she wants to become a musician or cardiologist. Investigators have always found it odd that the first page ends with her writing, quote, "Maybe I'll even be a cardiologist or musician, who knows," end quote. And then the second page begins with, quote, "The law is that parents have custody of their kids until they turn 18, end quote. It's a very awkward transition, which gives off the impression that a passage of text might be missing between these 2 sentences, which would make sense if these were 2 separate pages of a journal in which a lot more was originally written in between. The second page concludes with the line, quote, "I'm sorry, Sarah Ray Boehm," which is what you'd expect to find at the end of a letter, but it appeared that a bottom section of the page had been torn off. Well, if the page had been taken from Sarah's journal, and the bottom section contained the beginning of the next entry that Sarah wrote, then that could explain why it's missing. While the words, quote, "to whoever cares" were written on the envelope containing the letter itself did not appear to be addressed to anyone who was living with her at the time, particularly since it contains the line, quote, "when my brother and mother went crazy, everybody forgot about me," end quote. From my point of view, the first page does come across like some stream of consciousness thoughts that Sarah was writing in her journal, and it is not until the end of the second page when it starts to resemble a message to someone, since she uses the word "you" in such sentences as, quote, "I don't mind you don't love me," and, quote, "by the time you read this note, I'll be gone." So could the whole thing be a weird pastiche of a letter that Sarah was legitimately writing and a past journal entry? Whatever the case, if an unknown third party assembled these pages together into a letter, then they were likely trying to create some sort of false narrative that Sarah ran away, even though her actions on the night of her disappearance didn't seem to point in that direction. But obviously, if Sarah was murdered by a stranger, how would they manage to get inside her bedroom and place this letter under her pillow? On one hand, it's been reported that some unidentified fingerprints, which did not match Sarah or her family, were found on the letter, which seems to point to the involvement of an outside party. But on the other hand, when Sarah's family first informed police about the letter, Jack inexplicably gave them a photocopy of it, and Phyllis hung on to the original for years before turning it over to the FBI. I guess it's possible that during this time period, some other people could have handled the letter and gotten their prints on it. If someone fabricated this letter with the intention of misleading the investigation, then I think they technically succeeded, as it planted the seeds in police's heads that Sarah disappeared voluntarily and was still alive somewhere, which is why they initially ignored the possibility that she was the Portage County Jane Doe and she was not identified until 2003. If the letter was planted, then I can see why the best suspect would be Jack, since he was separated from Phyllis and not living in the residence at the time, and no one seemed to notice the letter under Sarah's pillow until a few days after she vanished. The fact that Jack later wound up being charged with sexually abusing a 12-year-old female relative is a major red flag, and while it's never been conclusively proven if he ever abused Sarah, I can see why people would think he might have been capable of it, particularly since Sarah gave off warning signs to suggest she was an abuse victim. But it does seem like Jack has a pretty rock-solid alibi, placing him in Belmont County, Ohio, in the company of multiple witnesses on the night Sarah went missing, and it's been reported that investigators have all but cleared him of any involvement. And in case you're wondering, that particular section of Ohio is over 100 miles south of the Berlin Lake Wildlife Area, so I don't think there's a connection. Theoretically, if Jack had been abusing Sarah, an alternate possibility is that she was writing about this abuse in her journal, so Jack decided to get rid of it before anyone else could find it, but he decided to pull 2 pages out of the journal in order to put together a fabricated letter about her running away. However, that scenario doesn't make much sense either, because if the journal was documenting Sarah's abuse, Jack's simplest course of action would just be to get rid of it altogether, rather than going to all this trouble with the letter. We know that Sarah wrote about meeting a guy who, quote-unquote, gave me love and whatever else I was not getting at home, and described him as being a, quote-unquote, very, very abusive man, but obviously, the wording does not make it sound like she's referring to her father. Yet it's interesting how there is no reference to her father on either of the 2 pages, even though she specifically used the phrase, quote-unquote, when my brother and mother went crazy. I know that Jack and Phyllis were separated at the time Sarah went missing, and she apparently took it quite hard. I don't know how long they had been separated at that point, but I get the impression that Sarah wrote these passages after her father moved out, and she was quite unhappy with her home life, so that could explain how she wound up with another man who abused her. Investigators were unable to figure out who this man was, and nearly everyone in her personal life had no idea who he could have been, but I do find it odd how Jack claimed that Sarah had a boyfriend named Tony Z, yet it could not be confirmed if he actually existed. Once again, you have to wonder if Jack was attempting to create a false narrative in order to focus all the attention away from himself. Whatever the case, Jack passed away without admitting any culpability in what happened to Sarah, and his brother Kevin has told the press that in spite of his many faults, Jack genuinely loved his kids and was left devastated by the loss of his daughter. If by chance Sarah was involved with a man who had no involvement in her disappearance, I can see why he would not want to come forward, given that she was only 14 years old at the time, and he may have been considerably older. One detail which I'm surprised doesn't get more discussion is the poem written in French on the envelope containing the letter, as they definitely sound like the words of someone who was planning to run away. But it's never been made clear to me if Sarah was fluent in French, and whether it would have been in character for her to write a poem in another language. The poem also specifically contains the phrase, quote-unquote, "read the letter please," which indicates that they were supposed to be companion pieces, but if someone else wrote the poem and was pretending to be Sarah, it doesn't make much sense to me that they would write it in French. Even if you believe the letter was two separate pages which were cobbled together, how did the poem wind up on the envelope? Regardless of whether or not you believe the letter is legitimate, one thing which sounds like an indisputable fact is that its contents were in Sarah's handwriting. So I think it's safe to say that even if Sarah didn't write this letter right before she disappeared, those were her legitimate thoughts, and she was a very unhappy girl living a troubled life. Another baffling aspect of the case is the incident where an unidentified man allegedly attempted to abduct Sarah 10 months before she vanished. Investigators eventually began to theorize that Sarah fabricated the story in order to explain away some injuries she may have suffered as the result of abuse from someone in her personal life. I mean, I'm all for believing victims, but Sarah's letter specifically contained the phrase, quote-unquote, "Didn't anyone wonder why I always had injuries and said I fell?" So I don't think this theory is an unreasonable one. Since Sarah was known for being very quiet and introverted and did not have a lot of close friends, it's certainly possible that she could have secretly become involved with an abusive man without telling anyone, and that she made plans to go see him on the night she disappeared. If this case happened today in the era of cell phones, texting, and social media, I'm sure investigators would have been able to turn up some evidence of communication between Sarah and this mysterious man, but back in 1994, it still would have been possible for her to do something like this under the radar. If Sarah went to see this guy and he killed her, that still doesn't explain why her body wound up 50 miles away in Ohio. However, if he did not live in the Rochester area and hailed from out of town, that could explain why no one from Sarah's personal life knew who he was. Sarah very well could have climbed into a vehicle with him and was driven out of the area before she was killed, and her body was subsequently dumped in the Berlin Lake Wildlife Area. But if this is what happened, does this mean that Sarah's killer was also responsible for murdering Kathryn Menendez? Well, like I've already mentioned, we only have a limited amount of information about Kathy's case, but it sounds like a couple of people from her personal life who lived in or around her hometown of Alliance, Ohio, were looked at as potential suspects. If one of them was responsible for her death, then I'd say that decreases the likelihood that they traveled all the way to Rochester and killed Sarah, so it may be nothing more than a coincidence that both victims' bodies were found in the same area so close together. But even so, it's reasonable to assume that Sarah's killer would have needed to have some knowledge of the Berlin Lake Wildlife Area in order to even find the spot where they dumped her body, since it was a considerable distance from the main road. So was there anyone from Sarah's personal life who had ties to that location? I know that back in 2021, the Beaver County District Attorney's Office announced that they had a strong person of interest in the case who was serving time in prison and had ties to both Beaver and Portage counties, and was scheduled to take a polygraph in the near future, but we haven't heard any follow-up. If this guy was responsible for killing her, I suppose we can take comfort in knowing that he's locked up right now, but it would be nice if he was conclusively linked to the crime. Given that Sarah's remains were out in the elements for nearly 4 months, it's unclear to me if any potential DNA evidence belonging to an outside party was found. In 2015, it was reported that hair which did not belong to Sarah had been found near her body, and investigators were hoping to test it for DNA, but I'm not sure if it could be conclusively established if the hair belonged to the killer. But of course, Kathy's body was recently exhumed in hopes of obtaining a DNA profile, so if this pans out and the DNA can be linked to a suspect, then perhaps this person will also be linked to Sarah's murder. During his appearance on the episode of On the Case with Paula Zahn, Beaver County Detective Andy Gall described Sarah's murder as the most confusing case he has ever worked on, and I can definitely understand where he's coming from, because nothing seems to make any sense. It's confusing enough that Sarah's body was found 50 miles from her home, but the cryptic letter has only muddied the waters even further, and I definitely think there's something off about the whole situation. So hopefully, at some point, we will finally get to learn the full truth about what actually happened. So if you happen to have any information about the murder of Sarah Boehm, please contact the Beaver County District Attorney's Office at 724-773-8550. That's 724-773-8550. And if you happen to know anything about the murder of Kathryn Menendez, please contact the Portage County Sheriff's Office at 330-296-8626. That's 330-296-8626. You can also call the FBI tip line for either of these cases at 1-800-CALL-FBI. That's 1-800-225-5324. Anyway, before I bring this episode to a close, I want to take a few moments to discuss another unsolved cold case involving a teenage girl, which took place in Pennsylvania during the mid-1990s, and that's the murder of Anna Marie Callahan. I see no reason to believe this crime is connected to the other two cases I just discussed, but I still want to give it some attention. On the afternoon of Sunday, October the 15th, 1995, the body of 16-year-old Anna Marie Callahan was found along the banks of the Monongahela River in Fayette County, just outside the borough of Belle Vernon. She was resting against a tree located halfway down a steep 20-foot embankment, and it's been theorized that the killer may have been attempting to roll her body down the embankment into the river before it was blocked by the tree. Anna had an extension cord wrapped around her neck, which was used to strangle her to death, and her hands were bound with duct tape. But oddly, someone had also placed flowers in her hands. Anna was only 4'10" and weighed 80 pounds, and was dressed in clothes which seemed too big for her, so when law enforcement found her body, they initially assumed she was a much younger child and were surprised to learn that she was 16. However, due to a long history of skipping school and failing her classes, Anna was technically still in the 6th grade. At the time of her death, Anna was living with her mother and stepfather, Mary and William Callahan, in McKeesport, a suburb of Pittsburgh, located just over 20 miles away from the spot where her body was found. And while she had been a student at Cornell Middle School, she barely attended and had a reputation for being incorrigible. Since Anna's family moved around a lot, school officials and the McKeesport Police Department's Juvenile Division were always trying to track her down, and in 1993, an unidentified man was charged with truancy for allowing Anna to be absent from school for 30 days. In January of 1995, the same man was fined $300 after Anna missed 64 days of school, and by April of that year, Anna's amount of absence had increased to 125 days, so the man wound up being sentenced to 5 days in jail. It's also been reported that in February of 1995, Anna's mother Mary was sentenced to 10 days in jail for 2 counts of curfew violation which were incurred when Anna was caught in downtown McKeesport after an 11 p.m. curfew was issued. According to Anna's family, the last time they saw her was on the evening of Friday, October the 13th. They said that she was talking with an acquaintance outside the residence before she left with them, but even though Anna told her mother that she would be back by 11:30 p.m., she never returned. But since Anna had a history of running away, and it was not uncommon for her to come and go at all hours, her family never officially reported her missing. The identity of the acquaintance whom Anna was seen with has never been revealed publicly, though it's been speculated that they may have traveled to Belle Vernon together. At some point on Saturday, October the 14th, Anna was reportedly seen playing on the banks of the Monongahela River, but her body would be found in the same area the following day. In October of 2013, John F. Marshall, a trooper for the Pennsylvania State Police, told the press that some suspects were immediately developed during the early stages of the original investigation, and they were still considered to be viable all these years later. He said these suspects included people that Anna hung out with, as well as some transients and registered sex offenders who were known to be in the Belle Vernon area at the time of her death. Marshall also confirmed that Anna had substance abuse issues and said that she, quote-unquote, liked to run the streets, which I'm guessing is code for saying that she was involved in sex work. Marshall expressed his suspicions that Anna was killed by someone from her personal life whom she was familiar with, and this murder came about after this individual made sexual advances against Anna, which were rejected. As far as I can tell, no further details about the investigation have been released, though it was reported that DNA evidence was collected from Anna's clothing and other items from the murder scene. After a DNA profile was created, it was entered into the combined index DNA system, but it failed to turn up any matches. Obviously, I don't have enough information about Anna's case in order to form my own theory about who killed her, but man, it sounds like she led an incredibly sad and troubled life, and it's heartbreaking to think that someone may have taken advantage of Anna in order to kill her. But if there is DNA evidence, hopefully forensic genealogy can be used to eventually identify the perpetrator. So if you happen to have any information on the murder of Anna Marie Callahan, please contact Troop B of the Pennsylvania State Police at 724-929-6262. That's 724-929-6262. You can also contact the Pennsylvania Crime Stoppers tip line at 1-800-262-3080. That's 1-800-262-3080. Anyway, another special thanks to listener Maria Milchman for narrating the opening of this episode. We've been carrying on this monthly listener voiceover contest for 7 years now, and if you've already entered, you're automatically eligible for our next random drawing, so you don't have to do anything. But if you'd like to enter and haven't done so, all you have to do is send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, naming the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see featured on this podcast. So once again, send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Also, one final reminder that this coming Saturday, August the 24th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll be holding one of our annual Unsolved Mysteries Live Watch Marathons, in which I will screen classic segments from the show, and you can watch them and chat with myself and your fellow listeners. If you'd like to join us, you can find the link to our screening room in our show notes and pinned at the top of our social media pages. Once again, it's taking place this coming Saturday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and we hope to see you there. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 6 years, our Patreon page has released nearly 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about an infamous case from Unsolved Mysteries, the 1994 disappearance of Tina Marcotte, and the subsequent death of the prime suspect, Tom Keeter, who supposedly ended his own life by allowing his head to be crushed with a forklift. In addition, I have also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my two co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, cover an unsolved missing persons case, the 1989 disappearance of Melanie Melanson. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we have over 60 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Hayden, Patricia A., Adrian, Daniel K., Greg S., and Becca. Thank you all so much for your support. I'm also excited to announce that this coming fall, I will be attending yet another podcasting event, the Berkshire Podcast Festival, which is taking place in North Adams, Massachusetts from October the 18th to the 20th. It's being organized by Josh Hallmark of the True Crime Bullshit podcast and will feature a number of high-profile shows, including yours truly. If you would like to purchase tickets, please visit their website, berkshirepodcastfestival.com, and use our specialized promo code, COLD2024, to get a 35% discount on tickets. Once again, that's berkshirepodcastfestival.com, and use the promo code COLD2024 to get a 35% discount. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter or Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.